Is this, am I on? Okay. Yeah. Well, good evening and welcome to the May Hatfield Museum and History Society Community Program. I'm Larry Stevens, President of the Society, and I thank you for joining us tonight, both in person and on Facebook. I have just a few brief announcements before I get into tonight's program. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation and would like to support the work of the Society, we have a donation crock up here on the front table, or for those watching on Facebook, you should be able to find a donate button somewhere on that page. Donations of any size are greatly appreciated, and to encourage you to donate this evening, we're giving everyone who makes a donation a souvenir commemorative Hatfield drag strip decal while supplies last. And thank Jeff Smith for making those and donating those to the Society. If you could, please help us out by folding up chairs at the end of the evening. That would be greatly appreciated. And please join us in thanking our refreshment committee tonight. Debbie Stevens, Shirley Culp, Nancy France, and June Detweiler. Thank you, ladies. All right, with that, we'll get right into tonight's program. Oh my, move over a little bit. All right, it's wonderful that so many folks have joined us this evening. We got a packed room, so appreciate you coming out for tonight's presentation on colonial fireplace cooking and early American recipes. I'm just kidding, of course. Tonight's program is the Hatfield Museum and History Society, or the history of the Hatfield Speedway. And I do want to mention, for those of you who may not be aware, that we do have a display right now at the Hatfield History Museum on the Speedway, so with a lot of great pieces of memorabilia from the Speedway. So make an appointment through our website or give us a call, and we'll be glad to set up an appointment for you to come down and visit the museum. It's open by appointment only at this time, so I think you'd enjoy that. Now, I know that many of you out there are probably passionate and diehard racing enthusiasts and surely know more about racing than I do. Therefore, before I begin tonight's presentation, I feel it necessary to post this. I don't have a clicker here, dear. Stand by. We're experiencing a technical difficulty. There we go. All right, just a little legal notice and disclaimer. The presenter of this program, that's me, is by no means an expert or even a novice for that matter on racing in general or on the history of the Hatfield Speedway. All information contained herein has been compiled by various sources, including books, newspaper articles, and internet websites, and to the best knowledge and intentions of the presenter, that's me again, is an accurate presentation on the subject. The presenter, that's still me, apologizes in advance for any inaccuracies, and those desiring to correct any said inaccuracies may speak to me following the program. Okay, so with that out of the way, on with the program. There we go. Human beings are an incredibly competitive species, both male and female, but especially, I think, the male of the species. And speed is one area of competition that has probably been around forever. I would not be surprised if one day Abel said to Cain, "I'll bet that I could get to that fig tree before you." But the earliest actual record of competitive running was during an Irish sporting festival that dates back to 1829 BC. But man could only go so fast on two legs. So it was a natural progression that one day one man would say to another, "I believe that my horse could go faster than your horse." And horse racing was born. But horseback racing was soon overshadowed by the popularity of chariot races. And this is an urn from 500 BC depicting a Greek chariot race. Chariot racing was the most prestigious competition in the early Olympic Games. Horse racing would continue to grow in popularity over the years, and men would spend their lives and fortunes trying to figure out how to breed faster and faster horses. And no one, it seems, was immune from horse racing fever. Even here in rural Hatfield Township, which was of course predominantly a farming community, horse racing was still quite popular. The earliest record I have found about horse racing here in Hatfield was in an article about the Treewigtown Fair, which was first held in 1908 in the tiny village of Treewigtown, also known as Hatfield Square. Treewigtown Village was located on the Bethlehem Pike, about halfway between the villages of Calmer and Line Lexington. The sleepy little village would become a beehive of activity during the fair. And this was a regular, full-sized agricultural fair with exhibits of livestock, farm equipment, farm wives' kitchen skills, and sideshows. And it was reported that there were also horse races held during the fair up and down the dirt Bethlehem Pike. In October 1920, a man by the name of Henry K. Gottschall and a group of other men got together and started talking about building a half-mile track for racing horses in Hatfield. They soon formed the Hatfield Driving Association and made an agreement to lease a 16-acre tract of land off a 40-foot road just west of the Hatfield borough border, where they planned to construct a track where they would hold afternoon horse races. There it is. That's where they bought the property to build the track. And before long, Hatfield had the distinction of having a racetrack with one of the widest home stretches in the East. On July 9th, 1921, the first sulky horse race, a descendant of chariot racing, was held on the new track. Bobby O., a horse owned by Monroe Ott, won that very first race. Perhaps coincidentally, the Hatfield Driving Association elected Mr. Ott as its first president. Henry Gottschall, celebrated as a talented driver, trainer, and boarder of horses at his farm on the corner of Vine Street and Maple Avenue, became the association's racing secretary. The Driving Association soon purchased the 16-acre tract of land that they were leasing, and in 1924 purchased an additional 24 acres from a neighboring farm. Now, it wouldn't be right, I believe, in a presentation on the Hatfield racetrack to at least not mention briefly the Montgomery County Fair, which was held on the racetrack's grounds. So it was in 1925 that members of the Hatfield Driving Association got together with members of the Montgomery County Agricultural Association to discuss reviving the Montgomery County Fair, which had not been held for many years. It was agreed to move forward with the project, and Hatfield's William B. Hedrick was appointed to manage the first county fair at the new racetrack. The first annual Montgomery County Fair was held at the new Hatfield racetrack from September 15th to the 19th in 1925, and according to newspaper accounts, there were agricultural exhibits galore. And this 1925 photo shows the Hatfield racetrack's horse-drawn water wagon used to wet down the dusty dirt track, advertising the dates of the 1925 fair. Large crowds packed the stands during the 5-day fair week, which included a 105-horse harness racing program. And here's a feisty racehorse being brought under control by his handler at the Hatfield track. And notice the resemblance between this photo and the photo of the 500 BC urn that we saw earlier. Pretty remarkable likeness, I think. Automaker Henry Ford was once quoted as saying, "Auto racing began 5 minutes after the second car was built." The 1925 Fair Week in Hatfield was topped off on the final evening with some auto racing, which, while still in its infancy, was growing quite rapidly in popularity as the speed of the cars increased. This photo was from a 1931 race held at the Hatfield track. Just like today, back in the 1930s, auto racing was a pretty risky sport. And I think it's safe to say that it was even more so back then, lacking the many safety features of today's race cars. One of the earliest fatalities at the Hatfield track, and perhaps the very first one, was that of Vernon Cook on October 15th, 1932. Cook was running a great race coming from behind in a 15-mile sweepstakes event when he lost control coming out of a turn. As his automobile rolled over, Cook was thrown from his racer and onto the track. His car continued on to crash through the high-board track fence, narrowly missing several boys who were watching the race from a tree. And I'll speak more on these tree people later. Meanwhile, as other race cars whizzed by him as he laid on the track, spectators finally pulled Cook off of the track, but he had already suffered a badly crushed head and chest and died while being taken to the Grandview Hospital in Sellersville. By the mid-30s, although harness racing remained quite popular, auto racing had become even more popular and was the competition of choice at what had by then become known as the Hatfield Speedway. This photo shows the Hatfield Joint Consolidated School building in the foreground with the Hatfield Speedway in the background on the left. In addition to horses and cars, motorcycle racing also took place at the Hatfield Speedway. Here are some motorcycles racing around the Hatfield Oval during a May 1940 event. And another shot of the motorcycle racers. And notice that there are several people, men or boys, I suppose, have saved the price of admission and are enjoying watching the races for free from their perches high up in the trees. Here's another picture of the motorcycle racers along the back stretch. I have mentioned briefly the Montgomery County Fair that was revived in 1925 and held on the grounds of the Hatfield Speedway. Well, by 1940, the annual fair had grown into an incredibly huge affair and was the biggest event of the year for many Montgomery County residents and especially Hatfield residents. In fact, the 1940 Montgomery County Fair was probably the largest ever held. The organizers pulled out all the stops and arranged to have movie star hero, cowboy hero, Tom Mix as the main attraction that year. Decline. Sorry, I thought I'd turn that off. So Tom Mix was the main attraction in 1940. After retiring from the silver screen, Tom Mix had bought a circus, which he eventually turned into a Western show. And here's Tom Mix addressing the crowd gathered at the Hatfield Fairgrounds. Mix's Western show drew a record-breaking 25,000 fairgoers to the grounds of the Hatfield Speedway on the fair's opening day, September 2nd, 1940. Roads were jammed for more than a mile at both entrances to the fairgrounds as people flocked to watch Mix and his troupe demonstrate their riding skills. And here's Tom Mix showing off his riding skills to the delight of the gathered crowd. Sadly, Tom Mix met a sudden, violent death in a highway accident while driving his 1937 yellow Cord in Tucson, Arizona, just 1 month after appearing in Hatfield that year. And here's a picture of the 1940 fair's midway, which was set up immediately adjacent to the racetrack. And the midway included fortune tellers, lots of good food booths, and rides such as the merry-go-round, bumper cars, and the tilt-a-whirl. And here's a photo of the racetrack and the fairgrounds from the air, and you can see that on the infield of the track that a ramp and loop have been constructed for a motorcycle thrill show, which may have looked something like this. I'm sure that was quite fun to watch. And here's another bird's eye look at the fairgrounds at the Hatfield racetrack. In addition to Tom Mix, there was plenty of other thrilling grandstand entertainment during the fair that year. And here's a motorcycle daredevil attempting a jump over 8 barrels. He's no Evel Knievel for sure, but this was only 1940 after all. And from the way that his front tire is hitting that last barrel, I'm guessing that maybe this jump didn't have a very smooth ending. And here's a motorcycle daredevil jumping through fire. And the Hollywood stunt aces were also there to destroy a bunch of vintage automobiles in their Daredevil thrill show. Of course, in 1940, these cars weren't really vintage, they were just used cars. And another picture showing the end result of the stunt. And this photo captures the moment just as the car starts crashing through a brick wall. And a photo of the aftermath. Here's a death-defying crash through a fiery wall with a stuntman on the hood. I always think it's kind of funny that the driver is cowering down in his seat when it's the guy on the hood that's doing all the dangerous work. And another Hollywood stunt aces car thrilling the crowd. The legendary Lucky Teeter world champion Hell Drivers were also at the 1940 Montgomery County Fair. They delighted the crowds with their auto thrill show, doing ramp jumps and flaming wall crashes. They also performed an amazing stunt using 1934 Fords for a head-on crash in which, at the moment of impact, the drivers would dive out of the vehicle through the suicide doors hinged at the back instead of the front. The drivers would dive out of the cars just in time and in a tumbling maneuver end up on their feet mere inches from their mangled cars, arms raised in victory as they once again defied certain death, much to the enjoyment of the spectators. Earl Lucky Teeter's luck ran out, however, less than 2 years later on July 5, 1942, when he was killed while attempting his rocket car leap stunt at the Indiana State Fairgrounds. In the summer of 1941, folks were still living large and enjoying the good life, unaware that their lives would be drastically changed in just a few short months by World War II. While auto racing had become very popular by then, harness races were still being held. These are some 1941 photos of a big day of harness racing at the Hatfield racetrack. Just look at the size of that crowd watching the race. In this picture, the trotters are going into the first turn, coming around the first turn, down the home stretch, and we have a winner by a length and a half. Back in 1934, a new class of auto racing, midget car racing, was started out on the West Coast. Its popularity grew quickly, but it wasn't until 1941 that the racing of midget cars, or doodlebugs as they were also known, reached the Hatfield Speedway. This 1941 newspaper article promoted the debut of midget car racing at the Hatfield Speedway. It reported that the nation's top-rated AAA midget auto racing stars would be whirling around Hatfield's half-mile dirt track for the first time on Sunday afternoon, June 8, 1941, in the Grand National Sweepstakes, a 100-lap program of racing thrills. It went on to say that racing experts considered the Hatfield Oval to be the fastest half-mile track in the East. More than 50 AAA drivers, including several who had competed in the Indianapolis 500 race, would be participating. The main event was a 25-lap race with speeds expected to reach as high as 75 and 80 miles per hour in Hatfield's long straightaways. Among the list of racing stars that participated in midget car racing at Hatfield was Charlie Miller, George Fonder, Frankie Bailey, Dave Rudolph, Doc Shanebrook, and Rex Records. While doing some research for this program, I found a rather amusing racing story on the internet that, although it is only remotely related to Hatfield, I still think it's worth telling. And it's about Bronco Bill Schindler, a famous one-legged race driver who raced at Hatfield Speedway many times. Schindler had raced midget cars on the East Coast since its introduction in 1934 and lost his left leg just above the knee in 1936 during the second of two races that he had entered that day. But that didn't keep Schindler from racing, although he vowed never to enter more than one race a day from then on. And although he had a wooden leg, he always raced without it. This led to a very dramatic and quite memorable crash at the Nutley Raceway in New Jersey just a few years later. During the race, Red Redmond's car went into a spin. Schindler plowed into Redmond's car, and Schindler's car sailed up into the air and hit the tall guardrail, which was built with angle iron to protect the crowd from loose wheels and other crash debris. One of Schindler's wheels snagged the fencing, and suddenly his car was hanging, tail down, dangling over the track. Schindler reached through the window and grabbed a cable that was nearby, just as the car fell down onto the track. That left Schindler hanging in the air several feet off the ground, right in front of the capacity crowd. Of course, everyone could immediately see that Schindler had only one leg. However, a great number of people who weren't familiar with the racer thought that he had just lost a leg in the crash. Women were swooning and fainting all over the place, and there was mass hysteria. Schindler hung from the cable for a few moments, then slipped and fell down onto the track below. He was lying on the track, right next to his car, nearly blocking the track. Along came another racer, still at full speed, with nowhere to go as he approached the crashed car and its driver laying on the track. In the matter of a split second, a crew member took 2 steps out onto the track, grabbed Schindler by his only ankle, and yanked him out of the way just as the race car flashed past through the opening. Neither Redman nor Schindler were hurt in the crash, but they had to dispatch a number of ambulances to deal with the people in the crowd who had fainted or who had other medical emergencies from what they thought they had just witnessed. So I think that's kind of a funny story, a racing story, especially since it didn't have a tragic ending. Although Schindler walked away uninjured that day, sadly, his life would later come to a rather tragic end on September 12, 1952. He had planned to compete in 2 races that day, something he vowed he would never do again after the accident that had cost him his leg. The first was a race at the Allentown Fairgrounds, and then he planned to race his midget car in the evening at the Hatfield Speedway. But on the first lap of the Allentown race, the rear wheel and axle assembly came loose on another racer's car and hit Schindler's car, sending him wildly out of control over the backstretch fence and into a concession stand, killing him instantly. A rather sad ending for Bronco Bill Schindler. Not long after the September 1941 Montgomery County Fair, the United States entered World War II, and lifestyles throughout the country were dramatically changed. The county fair was discontinued as people focused on the war effort. Racing on Hatfield Speedway's half-mile dirt track was also suspended, and the track sat quiet and empty for a number of years. Following the end of the war, racing was resumed in 1946, and Duke Wilcox, seen here, was now the Hatfield Speedway's promotional director. The Montgomery County Fair, however, held for 17 years at the Hatfield Speedway, did not resume and is now just a part of history. Midget auto racing, which had grown quickly in popularity in the 1930s and ran at Hatfield for only 1 season before the war, got even more popular in the post-war era. The high power and small size of the midget cars, however, combined to make midget racing quite dangerous, since the cars were very susceptible to rollovers. Motorcycle racing also continued to be quite popular in the post-war era. And here are some motorcycle racers coming out of the third turn, I believe, during an August 1946 event. In 1948, night racing was introduced at the Hatfield Speedway, utilizing a temporary lighting system. But as you can see here, it provided rather spotty illumination. That same year, on July 4th, 1948, tragedy struck when 33-year-old Howard Ashenfelder died of injuries sustained at the Hatfield Speedway. He had swerved to avoid another midget racer. His car went into a spin and then overturned on the third lap of one of the main events. Ashenfelder was rushed to Elm Terrace Hospital in Lansdale, where he soon died. This is midget racing great Red Redman posing before a September 1948 race at Hatfield. As you can see, this was still a time before roll cages, multi-point harnesses, and full face helmets. So it's easy to see how a rollover in one of these cars could result in serious injury or even death. Here's a couple of pictures of midget racers tearing around the Hatfield Speedway's half-mile dirt track in the 1940s. There's number 11. And by the way, the building seen here in the background was the original stable building from when the horse racing was more popular. Number 98. And two other midget racers. It looks like 44 in the back. And here's a great shot of a pack of racers coming out of the third turn. And again, look at all those tree and fence people enjoying the race for free. And here's a little closer look. Now, every time I do a program about the racetrack, someone inevitably comes up afterwards to tell me that they were one of the tree people. So let's see a show of hands. Any former tree people in the audience here? Oh, there we go. Okay. Not that. Someone else also once told me how she would watch the race from the back of her father's pickup truck that he would back up to the outside of the fence. So people were quite creative in watching the races for free. The temporary lighting installed at the Hatfield track in 1948 for night racing was not very good, to say the least. But in 1949, two 120-foot-tall light towers were installed in the center of the infield with a floodlight system that brightly lit up the whole track like daytime. The new lighting system was used for the first time on July 3rd of that year, 1949. On October 10th, 1949, midget auto racing star Jimmy Gibbons was killed in a crash at the Hatfield Speedway. As a crowd of 10,000 spectators watched, he lost control of his car on the 58th lap of one of the main events, crashing through a fence and suffered a fractured skull, which proved fatal. These are a few great color slides from around 1950, I believe. Here we see the midget racers all lined up, and the landmark Hatfield Borough Water Tower that used to stand on Wayne Avenue is seen in the background. Midget racers coming around the track's third turn. And coming down the back stretch with lots of colorful advertising on the back wall. And someone didn't quite make it out of the third turn. One of those dangerous rollovers that I talked about. And car number 2 getting a tow off of the track. Hatfield long-timers may recognize the guy on the left as Hatfield Borough Police Chief Herb Crater. In 1951, the Blue Comet Motorcycle Club sponsored a motorcycle race at the Hatfield Speedway in memory of Robert Little Bob Hollowell, a club member who was killed in a road accident. And this is his wife presenting a trophy to the winner of that race as an announcer on the left reports on the ceremony. Here's a nice bird's eye view of the Hatfield Speedway from around 1950. And you can see the track's new central tower floodlight system that was installed not too long before. And another great view of the Speedway from the sky with cars racing around the half-mile track at the bottom of the photo. In 1952, a 1/3 mile dirt oval track was constructed inside of the half-mile track. The outer half-mile dirt track was then closed in November 1953 and reopened as a paved banked speedway on May 27, 1954, just in time for the hugely popular Memorial Day races. Unfortunately, I have not come across any aerial photos of the track taken between 1952 and 58, when both the 1/3 mile track and the half-mile track were both running. Also in 1954, racing great George Marshman became the owner and promotional director of the Hatfield Speedway. Marshman, who retired from a 21-year race car driving career in 1950, was widely known as a spectacular promoter and showman. Marshman was working as a race car mechanic back in 1931 when the driver for his car failed to show up. Marshman jumped at the chance to drive, and so began his great racing career. He raced until 1950, when he was involved in a very serious crash, ending his great driving career. Incidentally, it was George Marshman that came up with the idea for the demolition derby just a few years earlier in 1951. Marshman got the idea after witnessing a crash at the Pottstown racetrack and noticed how the fans flocked around the cars and drivers. He decided right there and then that he would run a race where the idea was to eliminate the other cars by crashing into them. And he first called it a wreck-'em race, and it was an immediate crowd pleaser. Soon, wreck-'em races were held at many other racetracks, and the name eventually morphed to Destruction Derby, and then finally Demolition Derby. Here's a poster from 1954 advertising the Foreign Car Grand Prix at the Hatfield High Speedway, which was a new class of race at the Hatfield track that year. I wasn't able to nail down the exact year it was begun, but certainly by 1955, the Hatfield Speedway had established a powder puff division for women who enjoyed the thrill of racing. And here's a photo of a group of powder puff racers. This photo shows Dick Fleck taking his modified stock car on a victory lap around the Hatfield track, waving the checkered flag in 1957. Fleck had won 13 of 16 feature races at Hatfield in 1957, and he was also the track champion that year. This is Ronnie Paulus in his number 2 midget at Hatfield in 1957. Paulus was killed later that same year in a race at the Hagerstown Speedway in Maryland. Now, an interesting side note on race car drivers. Drivers would sometimes race using false names, and there was a variety of reasons that they would do this. Some didn't want their mothers to find out that they were engaged in such a dangerous sport. And others might have been hiding it from their bosses, who might disapprove. Or perhaps they drove it at more than one track and didn't want the promoters of one track to know that they were skipping their race to run elsewhere. Another reason to assume an alternative racing identity was that injuries received from racing might not be covered by insurance. But with a false name, if you got hurt, you could simply tell the insurance company that you fell off a ladder or something like that, and no one would be the wiser. So those racers were quite a clever bunch. This is a 1958 aerial view of the Hatfield Speedway, in which you can easily see the 1/3 mile oval dirt track that was constructed in 1952. The half-mile paved track that opened in 1954 was short-lived, as it was abandoned just 4 years later in 1958, the year that this photo was taken. That year, the 1/8 mile paved drag strip was created, using the half-mile track's wide front stretch. And there's the drag strip there. And here's a clearer photo of the speedway with the new after the new drag strip was created. It was a tight squeeze getting the required 1/8 mile to fit on the track. In fact, they needed to open the track gate for racers to decelerate outside of the gates. Those that didn't slow quickly enough ended up somewhere in the field beyond. Horses, cars, and motorcycles weren't the only races held at the Hatfield Speedway. To help fill the speedway seats, track promoter George Marshman would occasionally organize races on zebras, ostriches, and even camels. The race car drivers would race these animals for a short distance, much to the delight and amusement of the crowds. These types of promotional races are apparently still popular, as this camel racing scene was captured not too many years ago at the Meadowlands racetrack in New Jersey. Another promotional event held at the Hatfield Speedway in 1958 sadly ended in tragedy. George Fonder, one of the nation's leading midget car racers in both the pre-war and post-war eras, came out of retirement to return to his hometown track at the Hatfield Speedway to race as a favor to track owner George Marshman. Sadly, Fonder was fatally injured in a Hatfield midget race on June 14, 1958, when he crashed into the fence coming out of the fourth turn. He was taken to North Penn Hospital in Lansdale, but was dead on arrival. I found some other memories of the Hatfield Speedway that I thought were rather amusing. Now, anyone who lived within a half mile of Hatfield's dirt racetrack could testify to just how dirty that track was. If you were downwind on race day, you had to keep all of your house windows closed in order to keep the dirt out. And during the hot summer, in a time before air conditioning, this could make it quite uncomfortable. Many Hatfield folks living near the track just planned to spend the day out of town, perhaps relaxing at a park to escape the dirt and heat. One guy remembered that it was so dirty at the track that when you walked through the gate, the ticket that they gave you already had track dirt on it. And the concession stand at the track sold Pennsylvania Dutch pretzels that appeared as if they were chocolate covered, except it wasn't chocolate but track dirt that they were covered with. Someone else recalled that track owner George Marshman liked to keep playing the same record on the racetrack's loudspeaker system all through the night between each race, the same song, a banjo rendition of When You're Smiling. And I suppose that could get quite annoying after a time. The dirt problem caused by Hatfield's 1/3 mile dirt track may have been helped in 1959 when it was advertised that the track was made into a dust-free dirt track. I haven't come across anything that indicated just how this was accomplished, nor to what degree it may have been successful. In the July 1959 edition of Rod Builder and Customizer magazine, the Hatfield Speedway was featured in an article titled America's Wildest Drag Strip. This photo, which appeared with the article, shows the view from the track's timing booth. And another photo from the article showing two cars speeding down the drag strip. And here's a picture of popular racing announcer Dick Heist. The 1959 racing season at the Hatfield Speedway ended with a tragedy that almost took the life of Aldo Andretti. Now, even if you are not a fan at all of racing, I'm sure that you have probably heard of racing legend Mario Andretti, but you may not have heard of Aldo Andretti. Twin brothers, Mario and Aldo Andretti, were born in Italy in 1940. At a very young age, like many boys, they loved to go fast. Their father took them to a couple of car races in Italy, and they were both instantly hooked on racing. They dreamed that someday they too could be race car drivers. The Andretti family came to the United States in 1956 and settled in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, where the 16-year-old Andretti boys were thrilled to learn that they actually lived near a racetrack. They started hanging around the racetrack as much as they could, learning as much as they could about race cars. And this is a picture of Aldo and Mario Andretti when they were 16 years old, posing next to a race car. The next year, when they were 17 years old, the twin Andretti brothers got together and bought a 1948 Hudson Hornet to turn into a race car. 2 years later, in 1959, the Andretti brothers' Hudson Hornet car, number 7, was ready to race. Now, I'd like to throw in this next little bit of trivia in case there are any younger kids in the room, but I don't see any, so you can all play. Does anyone know of another famous Hudson Hornet from a Pixar movie made 16 years ago in 2006? Anyway, the movie's Cars. Anybody know what the Hudson Hornet was? Thank you, Johnny Cash. It was Doc Hudson from the Pixar movie Cars. And you see the resemblance? Okay, back to the Andretti brothers. Gonna get me singing. It was 1959, and the Andretti brothers' Hudson Hornet was now ready to race. Now, Mario and Aldo Andretti had absolutely no racing experience. They had only watched racing up to that time. They took their car to the half-mile dirt racetrack of the Nazareth Speedway near their home and flipped a coin to see who would get to drive in that first race. Aldo won the coin toss, and even with no racing experience, Aldo won that very first race. Mario drove in the next race, and he also won as well. In fact, the Andretti brothers managed to win all of their first 4 races. And they continued to do very well for the rest of that racing season. Now, all this racing was done without the knowledge of their parents, because they would not have approved of their participation in such a dangerous hobby. Unfortunately for the boys, their Italian-born father didn't speak any English at all, so he had no idea that his co-workers at Bethlehem Steel were congratulating him every Monday morning for his son's victories that weekend. The brothers' secret came to an end, however, when during the very last race of the 1959 racing season, Aldo lost control of his car in a qualifying heat at the Hatfield Speedway, which caused his car to flip end over end. The car's roof collapsed, and Aldo was terribly injured. His helmet split open, and Aldo suffered a fractured skull, ending up in a coma. The prognosis wasn't good at all for Aldo Andretti. Everyone thought that he would probably die, and a priest was called in to give him his last rites. But 4 days later, he miraculously awoke out of his coma. Mario continued to race in 1960 while his brother Aldo continued his long road to recovery. Mario was a bit concerned about Aldo ever returning to racing, but Mario's dream had always been that the two of them would conquer the racing world together. So when Aldo was well enough to climb back into the driver's seat, Mario bought him a sprint car to race. Had it not been for his crash at the Hatfield racetrack, things might have turned out very differently for Aldo Andretti. He was a great racer, and many say that he was even better than his brother Mario. But Aldo was just never quite the same after the Hatfield crash. A freak accident resulted in another fatality occurred at the Hatfield Speedway in July 1961. But this time, it wasn't even a racer that was killed. It was a 33-year-old maintenance man who was electrocuted in front of 1,500 spectators while he was on top of one of those tall light towers, working to adjust the lights that illuminated the track. He was on a platform with another worker and had been using a walkie-talkie to communicate with track owner George Marshman on how the lights should be positioned when the long antenna of his walkie-talkie, which was strapped on his back, contacted a 7,100-volt wire near the top of the 120-foot-tall tower. A co-worker administered artificial respiration on the platform, but was unable to revive the man, who was the father of 5 children. Firemen were unable to reach the platform with their 65-foot ladder truck, so they had to climb the tower to recover the worker's lifeless body, which they lowered to the ground by a rope. In August 1961, Hatfield Speedway owner George Marshman made an attempt to revive the legendary Montgomery County Fair that hadn't been held for 20 years since 1941. Even though there were some agricultural exhibits during the 8-day fair, they fell far short of the agricultural and 4-H exhibits that had attracted the Main Street public to the original Montgomery County Fair. There were lots of attractions and rides on the Midway, and kiddie television idols Sally Starr, Bertie the Bunyip, Howdy Doody, and others made appearances during the fair. But a new addition to the 1961 Fair Midway, the Raynell Show featuring Serena, seemed to turn off most fairgoers. And there were other complaints as well. It was said that the amusement rides were far too expensive, and apparently there were con games everywhere throughout the fairgrounds. Perhaps it was the presence of these less than wholesome entertainments that kept the 1961 fair from being a big success. But in any event, the 1961 attempt to revive the Montgomery County Fair proved to be a miserable financial failure and was never attempted again. In September 1961, the Hatfield Speedway had the distinction of hosting the National Open Championship qualifying race. The winner had the starting position in the richest sportsman's race, the $12,000 100-mile National Open Grand Championship at Langhorne. This photo was taken by Ray Masser with us this evening and shows how driver Howard Bilger in car 36 came to rest after taking out some of the outer metal fencing at the Hatfield track. And here's a 1962 photo of a pace car leading the pack before the start of a race. And the pace car driver is Harold Skinny Graham, also known around the track as Lucky. Graham belonged to the Professional Racing on Speedways Club, and it was his turn to drive the pace car that night. This picture, I believe from 1962, shows Mario Andretti in the winner's circle at Hatfield after he won a memorial race in honor of racer Ronnie Paulus, who was killed in 1957. And that's Ron's brother, Jim Paulus, presenting the trophy to Mario. This is a 1962 newspaper clipping advertising sprint car races at the Hatfield Speedway. It touted it as the nation's most spectacular speedway. And there's a few familiar racing names there at the bottom, including Bob Marshman. Bobby Marshman was the son of Hatfield Speedway owner George Marshman. On Labor Day of 1963, the Hatfield Speedway was where racing history was made. Mario Andretti had won a feature race that afternoon at Flemington, New Jersey, and then he went to the Hatfield track that same evening where he won 2 more feature midget races. He had won 3 feature races in one day, which was unheard of at that time, and I don't believe that it has ever been repeated again. This triple win was what really got Mario Andretti noticed for the big time. While Mario went on to enjoy a great, successful racing career, becoming one of the best car racers of all time, his brother Aldo did not do so well. He continued to race, but just wasn't as successful as before his 1959 crash at Hatfield. 6 years after his historic triple win, on his 5th attempt, Mario Andretti finally won the Indianapolis 500 race in 1969. And here's Mario getting a victory kiss from the car's owner as his brother Aldo, in the orange shirt, looks on. A dark cloud seemed to follow Aldo, and his racing career after the Hatfield Speedway crash was unremarkable. Another terrible racing accident just a few months after Mario's Indy win in the sprint car that Mario had bought for him left Aldo horrifically disfigured and ended his racing career forever. A rather sad racing story that the Hatfield Speedway played a part in. Between 1963 and 1966, the Hatfield Speedway would claim 2 more lives. 27-year-old George Gankars was killed in a midget race on July 18, 1964, and a year later, Ernie Borelli was killed, and two others were injured in a 3-car crash during a midget race on July 16, 1965. And I believe that Ernie Borelli's death was the final fatality at the Hatfield Speedway. During the racetrack's 45-year history, at least 12 racers lost their lives while racing around the Hatfield ovals. A death in December 1964 shook the racing world, and especially the world of Hatfield Speedway owner George Marshman. The racing season was already over, and Bobby Marshman, George Marshman's son, was doing tire testing for Firestone at the Phoenix International Raceway. While doing a test run, a sensor on his car worked loose and fell into the fuel injector, sticking the throttle wide open. Bobby Marshman was terribly burned in the ensuing crash and died less than a week later, ending what looked like a promising racing career. Here's an interesting 1965 Help Wanted ad. Wanted, men or women with guts to crash head-on at 60 miles per hour, creating a 120 mile per hour impact at the 100-car destruction derby at the Hatfield Speedway. Of course, applicants had to be willing to sign a release in case of injury or death. So there you go. The last race at the Hatfield Speedway was held on September 24th, 1966, and consisted of a 20-lap stock car feature event and a 100-car demolition derby. At the end of racing that day, the Hatfield Speedway was closed forever. Some say that following the death of his son, George Marshman's heart just wasn't into racing any longer. Another story related to me was that George Marshman fell behind in his taxes for the racetrack property to the point that he finally agreed to sell the land to neighboring dairyman Raymond Rosenberger, who had been trying to buy it from him. You see, Mr. Rosenberger was no fan of the races, especially all the noise and dirt that they created. As part of the sale, Rosenberger apparently agreed to lease the track to Marshman for a short time. But when Mr. Rosenberger was approached about renewing the lease for the property, he allegedly responded that he didn't need the money and that he didn't like the noise. And that was the end of that. Rosenberger soon had the land bulldozed and the buildings razed, erasing almost every trace of the track.